Iran continues to maintain its stranglehold over a tiny elbow of water called the Strait of Hormuz. It is the only route connecting oil-rich countries in the Persian Gulf to the rest of the world.
There is a $100 billion plan sitting in the files of energy ministries, engineering firms, and diplomatic back channels around the world. A plan to make the world's most dangerous shipping corridor completely obsolete. The Strait of Hormuz controls 20% of the entire planet's oil supply, and someone has already drawn the blueprints to replace it entirely.
Sandwiched between Iran and Oman, the strait is only 24 miles wide at its most narrow point.
The experts who spent their careers defending the old system simply didn't see it coming. In fact, as recently as 2017, some of the most decorated strategic minds on Earth called this idea flat out impossible, too expensive, too political, and too dangerous to ever become real. They were wrong, and by the time the full picture becomes clear in this video, you'll understand exactly why the silence from those same experts right now is the most alarming signal of all, because the window to act is 2025 to 2035. The construction timeline is already 10 years behind, and almost nobody is talking about it. Most disturbing choke point. Every single day, roughly 20% of the world's entire oil supply passes through a single narrow strip of water. At its tightest point, this corridor is just 21 miles wide. The actual shipping lanes inside it are even smaller, 2 miles in each direction. That's it. 2 miles of open water quietly separating the global economy from chaos. This is the Strait of Hormuz, and right now, it is the most strategically fragile piece of ocean on Earth. Think about what that means. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates. Every barrel of oil leaving those countries must pass through this single exit. There is no back door. There is no alternative route capable of handling the volume. If something goes wrong in those 21 miles, the ripple effect hits every economy on the planet within days. And things have been going wrong. In recent years, the strait has become a pressure cooker. Warships from multiple nations now patrol these waters in a slow, tense rotation. Insurance premiums for oil tankers have surged so dramatically that some shipping companies restructured their entire global operations just to reduce exposure to this single corridor. Tankers have been seized by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. Ships have been damaged by underwater drones. There have been direct military confrontations where a single miscalculation could have ignited something far larger. Here's the catch. The strait doesn't even need to close to cause a crisis. The mere possibility that it could be disrupted is enough to send energy markets into panic. That panic doesn't stay on trading floors. It moves to gas stations, grocery stores, and manufacturing plants. Within days, a threat in those 21 miles becomes inflation in your city. A disruption in the Strait of Hormuz wouldn't be a regional problem. It would be a simultaneous global shock. Which raises a question that engineers and strategists have been quietly obsessing over for decades. What if ships simply didn't have to go through it at all? In 2019, Dr. Richard Nephew, energy security analyst at Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy, was reviewing tanker seizure data from the Persian Gulf when he stopped at a single line in the report and said, out loud, to no one, "We have no answer for this." He wasn't referring to the seizure itself. He was referring to what would happen if it escalated further. If the next incident wasn't a tanker but a pipeline, not a warning shot but a blockade. Nobody in his field was asking that question yet, and the plan that would eventually force them to ask it was already being drafted in a country most of them had barely considered. The $100 billion bypass. Look at a map of the Arabian Peninsula and something immediately jumps out. At the very tip of Oman, where the land juts northward into the Persian Gulf like a jagged blade, there is a peninsula called Musandam. Several places along that peninsula, the distance between the Persian Gulf on one side and the open Gulf of Oman on the other is remarkably short, just a few dozen miles of land separating two bodies of water. On a flat map, the solution looks almost obvious. Cut a canal straight through. Ships leaving the Persian Gulf could bypass the Strait of Hormuz entirely. Instead of threading through a politically charged military corridor patrolled by rival navies, tankers could slip through a purpose-built waterway into open ocean. Clean, direct, sovereign. The concept has a name: the Musindam Canal, and the price tag that serious feasibility studies have attached to it, somewhere between $100 and $300 billion. Depending on who you ask, which route they're analyzing, and how optimistic their assumptions are about modern excavation technology, that number stopped most conversations for a long time. In 2017, Dr. James Stavridis, former NATO, Supreme Allied, Commander and one of the most respected strategic minds in the United States, was asked directly about bypass infrastructure for the Persian Gulf. His answer was polite but final. The engineering was prohibitive, the politics were impossible, and the security calculus didn't justify the investment. $100 billion for a canal through mountains that might never be used. He moved on. Most serious analysts agreed with him, until the math changed, because here's what nobody expected. With global energy security deteriorating faster than models predicted, that price tag has quietly shifted from fantasy to feasibility in certain policy circles. And the nations most eager to see it built are not the ones Stavridis or anyone in his network would have named first. The mountain in the way. Before getting to who those nations are, we need to talk about why the engineering challenge is so severe. Because the people who have recently reopened this file are not ignoring the obstacles, they're pricing them differently. The Musindam Peninsula is not flat desert. It is the Hajar mountain range, one of the most rugged landscapes in the entire Middle East. Sharp limestone peaks rise straight out of the water. Some of these mountains climb more than 2,000 meters above sea level. That's nearly 7,000 feet of solid rock, standing between the Persian Gulf and the open ocean. Building a canal here wouldn't mean scooping sand with heavy equipment. It would mean carving through entire mountain ridges, and the canal couldn't be modest. To handle very large crude carriers, VLCCs, the largest oil tankers ever built, it would need to accommodate ships nearly 400 meters long, wider than a city block, carrying more than 2 million barrels of crude per journey. Deep, wide, seismically stable. Engineers who've studied the route estimate that hundreds of millions of tons of rock would need to be blasted and removed. Not sand, not soil, mountain rock. The kind requiring precision explosive charges, specialized boring equipment, and years of continuous operation just to open the initial navigation path. For comparison, the Panama Canal expansion, one of the great engineering achievements of the modern era, cost around $5 billion and took nearly a decade. The Musindam Canal, by most credible estimates, would cost 20 to 60 times that amount under far more hostile terrain. And get this, when Dr. Stavridis dismissed the canal in 2017, that Panama comparison was his entire argument. 5 billion versus 100 billion. Easy math, wrong framing. Because the people who have reopened this file aren't comparing canal costs to a construction project anymore. They're comparing it to the cost of a global oil crisis. Subscribe now, because the number coming in the next chapter is the one that moved this conversation from conference rooms into cabinet offices. The hidden cost of doing nothing. Let's run the numbers another way. When the Strait of Hormuz faces credible disruption threats, global oil prices can spike by $10, $20, or $30 per barrel in hours. The damage ripples simultaneously. Airlines bleed cash, manufacturing slows, consumer prices climb, governments release emergency reserves. A sustained 2-week closure, something that has never happened but has come measurably closer than most people realize, could cause economic damage in the trillions. Not billions, trillions. Some models put the figure at $3 to $7 trillion over a 90-day disruption period. Against that number, a $100 billion canal looks like an insurance policy with a reasonable premium. Here's the catch. The existing pipeline alternatives help at the margins, but not nearly enough. Saudi Arabia built the East-West pipeline to Red Sea terminals at Yanbu. The UAE built the Habshan-Fujairah pipeline to a port. Outside the strait, intelligent investments, both of them. But even at combined maximum capacity, they handle only a fraction of the daily volume moving through Hormuz. And critically, neither can carry liquefied natural gas exports, which have become just as geopolitically significant as crude oil, and which make up a growing share of what the world's most energy-dependent economies actually need every single day. The world's energy infrastructure organized itself around the Strait of Hormuz over 6 decades. Refineries were built for this route. Port infrastructure across Asia and Europe was sized and positioned around this flow. Insurance models, naval deployment strategies, and global shipping contracts were all written under the assumption that the strait would remain navigable indefinitely. Unwinding that dependency through pipelines alone would take another 6 decades and still leave the system dangerously exposed at the volumes that actually matter. The canal isn't just an engineering project. It's the only structural alternative that scales to the actual problem. And now for the part of the story that belongs in classified briefings. Who is actually pushing to build it? Because that part is the one nobody saw coming. The politics nobody talks about. The Musandam Peninsula belongs to Oman, and Oman occupies a diplomatically unusual position in the Middle East, essential to understanding whether a canal here is even politically possible. While neighbors have spent decades locked in rigid alliances and open rivalries, Oman has maintained working relationships with nearly everyone: Saudi Arabia, the United States, China, even Israel, through discreet back-channel contact that rarely makes headlines. Oman has served as a quiet diplomatic intermediary for some of the most sensitive negotiations in the region over the past 4 decades. When American and Iranian officials needed to communicate without public acknowledgement, Muscat was often where it happened. That unique positioning is simultaneously what makes a Musandam Canal politically imaginable and what makes it politically explosive. A canal of this scale wouldn't just be infrastructure. It would instantly become one of the most strategically significant waterways on the planet. Whoever controls access to it controls the alternative route for 1/5 of global oil supply. That's not a civil engineering project. That's a geopolitical asset nations go to war over, and Oman would sit at its center, a position that transforms its diplomatic neutrality from an asset into a liability overnight. And get this, a canal would not eliminate vulnerability. It would redesign it. Right now, the Strait of Hormuz is genuinely difficult to fully close. A natural waterway with overlapping jurisdictions and permanent naval presences that create their own deterrence. A canal is a different kind of target. A single artificial corridor with defined walls, known coordinates, choke points at both ends. A grounded tanker could block it for days. A precision strike could close it for weeks. Sabotage could take it offline for months. The world would trade one vulnerability for another, arguably a more fragile one. This is the expert consensus that most reporting glosses over, and yet the conversation keeps accelerating, because the nation that has moved furthest on this calculation isn't Oman or the Gulf states or the United States. The strategic power plays behind the canal. China imports roughly 17% of the oil passing through the Strait of Hormuz daily. Japan depends on it for nearly 90% of its crude supply. South Korea, India, Singapore, Taiwan, the entire economic engine of East Asia runs on energy flowing through those 21 miles. For all of these nations, a Hormuz disruption isn't a geopolitical abstraction. It's an existential economic event. And the question of who builds the alternative isn't academic. It determines who they'll be beholden to for the next 50 years. But here's what nobody expected. The nation that has moved furthest on the Musandam Canal calculation isn't Japan or South Korea. It's Beijing. China's Belt and Road Initiative has already funded ports, railways, pipelines, and industrial zones across Central Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Southeast Asia. Beijing has invested in deep water port infrastructure in Oman at Duqm. It has poured capital into Pakistani port development at Gwadar. It has systematically positioned itself as the infrastructure financier of last resort for projects that reduce energy supply chain vulnerability. A Musandam Canal fits that framework almost perfectly. It would reduce Chinese energy vulnerability to American naval dominance in the Persian Gulf. It would give Beijing leverage over a new globally critical waterway, and it would tie Oman's infrastructure development to Chinese capital for a generation. According to analysis in energy security policy journals, preliminary discussions about Chinese finance canal and bypass infrastructure in the Oman region were already circulating at the diplomatic level, not publicly, not on record, but in the back-channel conversations that shape decisions long before they become announcements. And get this. When Dr. Stavridis was asked specifically about Beijing's infrastructure positioning in the Gulf region in 2023, His answer was nothing like his dismissal in 2017. He didn't call it impossible anymore. He called it a serious strategic calculation requiring urgent attention. The same man. 6 years. Completely different answer. The experts didn't see it coming. And now that they have, some of them wish they hadn't. Because if Beijing finances this canal, it doesn't just build bypass infrastructure. It becomes the gatekeeper of the alternative to Hormuz. Every tanker captain, every energy ministry, every navy in the world answers to that reality every single day. Why? The timing of this matters. None of this is happening accidentally. The world is mid-transition, the most significant energy shift since the discovery of petroleum. Renewables are scaling. Electric vehicles are penetrating markets globally. Long-term oil demand projections are being revised downward in almost every credible scenario. And yet, that transition is measured in decades, not years. But here is the brutal short-term reality. For at least the next 20 to 30 years, the global economy remains structurally dependent on fossil fuels. Infrastructure transitions at the pace of capital replacement cycles, regulatory frameworks, and political will, not at the pace of technology. And during that transition window, supply chain security matters more than ever, not less. The fragility of the system increases as the political stakes around fossil fuels intensify. Here's the catch. The Strait of Hormuz is most vulnerable right now. Not in 40 years, right now. When tensions between Iran and the Western alliance remain unpredictable. When drone warfare has made military escalation cheaper and more asymmetric than any previous era. When a single incident, a tanker strike, a miscalculated boarding, a drone strike on port infrastructure, could trigger a cascade that existing frameworks weren't designed to contain. That is the window. 2025 through 2035 is the period analysts now assign the highest probability of a serious Hormuz disruption event. And the construction timeline for a Musandam Canal, assuming planning began today, runs a minimum of 10 to 15 years, which means the math is already wrong. The window and the timeline don't overlap, and the analysts who spent years calling this an engineering impossibility have arrived at a new question, not can we build it. But what happens to the global economy in 2028 or 2032 if we wish we had started building it in 2024? That question is more uncomfortable than most institutions want to answer on the record. When governments stop publicly dismissing an idea and simply stop talking about it, something has changed in the private conversation. Dr. Nephew understood that when he stopped at that line in 2019. The institutions he works with are still catching up. The geography of global power. Human civilization has always run on choke points. The Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, the Strait of Malacca, the English Channel, a handful of narrow passages silently organizing the movement of energy, goods, and power across the entire planet. For centuries, the nations controlling these passages held extraordinary leverage, economic, military, and diplomatic, over everyone who depended on them. Wars have started over less. Empires were built around them. The Strait of Hormuz represents this principle at its most extreme modern expression, more strategically concentrated than almost any other geographic point on Earth. And unlike most choke points, it has no historical redundancy. No parallel route has been built. No emergency bypass exists. The world simply decided this would work indefinitely and organized 60 years of energy investment around that assumption. It was a reasonable bet for a long time. It is a less reasonable bet now. But here's what nobody expected. The assumption is now being stress tested by the very experts who built their careers defending it. If the canal gets built with Western-aligned capital and international governance, it reduces Chinese strategic leverage across the Persian Gulf. If Beijing builds it, it hands China the most consequential infrastructure asset since the Suez Canal opened in 1869. And if it doesn't get built at all, and the Strait of Hormuz faces serious disruption in the 2028 to 2032 window, the period models now flag as highest risk. The cost will not be measured in billions. It will be measured in trillions. Your fuel, your food, your supply chain. Dr. Stavridis, the man who called this impossible in 2017, has started publicly asking whether the West needs an urgent infrastructure response to Chinese positioning in the Gulf region. He hasn't named the Musandam Canal directly, but the experts in his network have stopped laughing at it. The mountains are real, the politics are genuinely hard. The cost is almost incomprehensible by conventional infrastructure standards. None of that has disappeared, and none of it has stopped the conversation from accelerating. But neither has the pressure. Each year, more urgency, more capital, more serious players at the table. The question is not whether a bypass is needed. The question is whether the right people will build it, before the wrong people do. That answer is being written right now, in engineering studies, in diplomatic back channels, in the strategic planning divisions of energy ministries from Beijing to Riyadh to Washington to Tokyo. If you're watching this in 2025, you're watching it in the window, the decade when this decision gets made or doesn't. The decade when the experts who missed it are scrambling to catch up. Subscribe now, because every video in this series covers a piece of the infrastructure where most people don't know is already being fought. And the next one goes somewhere the analysts really didn't see coming.